folks. Wanted to do a follow-up video about my off-grid system because there's been a lot of interest in it, and address the key thing that I didn't talk that much about in that video, and that's the generator. So we're gonna get into that today. If you're new here, my name is Curtis Stone, and my channel is all about, mostly about living off-grid and sharing with you my journey in developing this overly ambitious off-grid homestead that we're 2 years into. And if you're curious and you want to see the development, we basically started with raw land. We had a small cabin we moved into, but if you want to see the last 2 years of development on this homestead, you can head over to fromthefield.tv, and I've vlogged a lot there. There's many hundreds of videos up there now with this homestead, building everything, building this whole system behind me. If you're just tuning into this video and you didn't watch the last one, I would suggest that you go check that one out. I'll put a link in the video here. Watch that one first for the greater context. But we've got 20 kilowatts of solar, and we have a generator, and we've got 96 kilowatt hours of battery storage. It's a 48 volt system, and it's totally off grid. So the one thing that I really wanted to show in more detail is our generator. And I think some people may have got the impression from the last video where I said, you know, we don't want to necessarily do laundry on a day like this. Like, it's snowing right now. There's some sun, there's some snow landing on the panels. And some people think, oh, well, if you can't live comfortably, then what's the point? Well, there's a lot of things to that. I mean, we want to be off grid. I don't want to be on the grid. I don't want to have my power turned off. For a large part, for the most part, us being off grid is a choice to take responsibility and have another step towards freedom. Not saying that everything's perfect and we're completely 100% self-reliant. That's just not the case. It's a scale of 0 to 100. It's not 0 to 1, right? If you're going to be off grid, people are like, oh, you have internet. Well, yeah, we have internet, because how else would you see my videos if we didn't have internet? How would you know about off grid if nobody posted videos about it or talked about it? So all these off grid purists who don't do anything, armchair quarterbacks, are always really quick to comment on these things. So anyways, going back to what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the generator, going to talk about the features, and what we can do with it, and how it's actually it's really sweet. So I didn't mean to give the impression that I couldn't do laundry on a day like this. I could if I wanted to. I just burn diesel. So that's totally doable. We're actually, with our system, we're not limited in any way, and that's why that was part of my ambition when I built this system, is I wanted to have a system where we could live comfortably. And a number of people have made comments, and they're good comments, a lot of these, about, they're kind of shocked, like, because we consume about 800 watts during the day per hour, which is a lot. And that's partly into the night too. And people make comments about, you need to have energy efficient this, not that. And it's like, yeah, I get it. Yeah, I know we don't have the most energy efficient appliances yet. That's because we're living in a cabin temporarily as we build our house. And once we finish our house, it's going to have all energy efficient appliances. So it will have a washer and dryer. The dryer will be a heat pump dryer, stuff like that. We'll have that. But we had other stuff in here that we're utilizing. And so I'm not in a rush to just blow more money. We've already spent a ton of money on a bunch of things. People say, you got to switch to LED lights. I hate LED lights. I can't stand them. So we consume more power as a result of that, and that's my choice. It's partly why I've built a big system, is so that I don't have to nickel and dime all the little things. I do not like LED light. I hate it. I don't mind it in some places, but in areas that we spend a lot of time in, I like incandescent or halogen lights. And so those are not as efficient as LEDs, but it's real light. LED is fake light. And go look into what LEDs are doing to people, the excessive blue light and things like that. It's not natural. And so it follows the pattern of a lot of things, the food people eat, the habits that they have. There's a lot of things out there that aren't good for you, and LEDs is one of them. So we don't use LED lights. So that's partly why we consume as much power as we do. Partly, I mean, there's a lot of other reasons too. Again, we don't have across the board the best energy efficient appliances, but we will once we finish the house. So this is all happening in stride, right? Everybody's like, why don't you have this? Why don't you have that? It's like, well, maybe I'll get there, but we're 2 years in and we spent a lot of money, and so that's kind of where we're at. It all takes time, and I'm done with the DIY aspect of my life. You know, there's a lot of armchair quarterbacks out there who have endless amounts of time to commit to ridiculous DIY projects. You know, the one that constantly comes up is, why don't you pump water up the hill to pull electricity off that? Well, there's a lot of reasons for that, and I addressed it in the last video. Or, what about sand batteries, Curtis? Have you looked into sand batteries? Yeah, kind of. Yeah, give me a turnkey model and I'll look at it. There's none. You know, what about hydrogen? Why don't you generate hydrogen? It's like, well, have you seen a turnkey model of that? No. What about rocket mass heaters? There's a lot of armchair quarterbacks out there who they're probably most likely single, don't have a family, and are semi-retired, who have endless amounts of time to dedicate towards DIY projects. That's not my context. I have a family of 4. I have a career. I don't want to spend endless amounts of time tinkering on something that will probably not yield anything. So I value my time, and I value your time. And so when I make videos, I try to show you what's working for me. And if you don't like that, I don't care. A lot of people get offended, and this is one that really bothers me. It's sort of an example of how Americana is just done. Like, people don't celebrate greatness anymore. They complain about not getting it served on a silver platter. And why don't you show us a real DIY example? It's like, well, it's because there's literally thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of videos on off-grid DIY solar that you can watch. But that's not what I'm doing. I'm trying to make a system so that I can build a very comfortable life for my family. And yes, we spent a lot of money, and that's how it is. If you don't want to do that, then don't do it. Shut up. Stop complaining. So anyways, back to the system. So this is our diesel generator. This building is not finished. It's not sided yet or anything. But what we have is a 13 kilowatt Yanmar diesel generator here. And yes, why didn't you get it bigger? I could have got it bigger. I could have spent another $20,000. Well, no, this thing cost me, I think this cost me about 14 grand all in Canadian. So it wasn't that bad. Of course, some labor to wire and hook it all up and all that. But it's good enough for us because we really only use this for a month of the year. This thing hasn't turned on since January 19th. So we've been, and even though the weather right now is really crappy, we're getting enough sunshine breaking through here and there, and also our days are longer now, that even on a day like this, well, I won't generate much solar today with the snow accumulated on the panels, but we haven't had to run the generator in a while. So, however, this thing is automatic. So this thing is wired to our whole system through a little console unit called the AGS, and it's basically just a fancy trigger. And it's hooked up to the whole system, and there's a number of triggers that will turn this thing on or off. And right now my batteries are maybe about 40%. So depending on how much power my wife wants to use today, this thing might just kick on. And it's set to kick on in a number of parameters. So there's basically 3 triggers. You could have more triggers if you wanted, but it reads the voltage of the batteries, which gives the system an idea of how much juice there is in the batteries. So my batteries are basically 0 at 48 volts. And they're probably about 5% at about 48.5. And reading voltage and we just don't have a BMS, which is a battery management system. That's not fully integrated into our system yet. I'd like to get it, but again, we're already 130 grand in. So I've been able to run this very well by just reading voltage. And the reason we don't have a BMS fully integrated is because our system uses Schneider Electric technology for the inverters and the charge controllers and all that. And I did batteries that weren't, call it, synced with Schneider. There's a way to do it, just haven't got there yet. So armchair quarterbacks, relax. We'll get there. But right now it reads voltage. So this system, if the batteries, so some of the lowest trigger, the last trigger, there's 3 triggers that would go in sequence. So the bottom trigger is if the batteries hit 48.5 volts for more than a minute, the generator will kick on. Above that, if the batteries go down to 49 volts for an hour, the system will kick on. And then on the top, if the batteries are, I believe it's 49.5, if their batteries are sitting at 49.5 volts for 24 hours, it'll kick on. So there's kind of 3 gates you'd go through. So if you were consuming, say, a medium amount, say I was pulling 2 to 4 kilowatts for around 24 hours, and then in that period, the batteries sank to 49.5, then the trigger starts counting 24 hours. And then if it doesn't change in there, or if it stays there for 24 hours, then the generator will kick on. And then the second trigger would be if for an hour the batteries were at 49 volts, it'll kick on. And that would be sort of where maybe my wife was firing up the laundry and the batteries weren't near empty yet, but if it was continuing that load at 49 volts, then the trigger would kick on. And then the last one, which is the 30 seconds or a minute, is so suddenly a big load spikes in and those other triggers didn't work because they don't work for that type. It would be all of a sudden a big load comes in and whoa, your batteries are draining fast, boom, the generator will kick on. So far this whole winter, it's worked really well. And I haven't had to I was managing it for a while because I was actually nervous. I didn't trust the triggers at first. And I just had to kind of relax and just let it go, and it's performed perfectly. So what happens with this generator is when it gets triggered, it'll fire up and it'll start it will start warming up. It has a 3-minute warm-up cycle, and then it'll load. And what happens then is that load goes towards the batteries and the load. So whatever's being consumed, it'll go towards the batteries, and I can set it. So in my Schneider system, I can set the battery charge rate. And so by default, I have it about 50%. So when this kicks on, this will produce, I find it's most efficient to let this produce about 80%, somewhere between 10 to 11 kilowatts instead of maxing it at 13 kilowatts. I can max it, but the fuel efficiency goes down. So I found that the fuel efficiency is most optimal if I'm running it at about 80%. So that's about 10 to 11 kilowatts. So essentially, let's call it 11. So 5.5 kilowatts would go towards charging the batteries, and the other 5.5 would go towards the load. Now, if my wife said to me, I want to do laundry, and we don't have a very efficient dryer right now, again, we will have one when our house is finished, but our dryer, if she runs it on low, it'll consume about 2 kilowatts. If she runs it on high, it'll consume 6. So we found that we can just run it low, and it'll consume about 2 kilowatts. And so if she wants to do laundry and maybe she turns on the vacuum or does some things that take an immediate load, I can just tweak. I'll just go and just open up my laptop, log into my local Schneider Electric system, and I can just change the battery charge rate. So I'll just put, say, 80% to the load and then 20% to the batteries. And so then I could handle a load of, 8 kilowatts, and then the other remaining 2 or 3 kilowatts would just go towards the battery. So I can tweak it in that way. I kind of have the freedom to decide how I want to delegate that energy. That's a really neat thing about that. So that's kind of what I wanted to say about that. Another neat option we have with the system, and I'll splice an image of it in here, is inside my main, where my main breakers are, I could bypass the whole thing. So let's say we had something happened where somehow the inverters were damaged. There was something wrong with the system. The batteries were down. Who knows? There could be a variety of different things that could happen. I can bypass the whole system. So I have a big switch in there that if I want to just run the generator and just go 100% to load, forget the batteries, forget everything else, I can do that. It'll still have to, the energy will still have to be, where is this DC? No, I think this is AC. I actually forget. One of my solar engineers that helped me set up might chime in the comments. But either way, I can bypass all the batteries and just go straight to load. And I could basically run this generator, and it will load itself based on the loads, and you can actually hear it. It's really neat when it runs. it's like a motor. It's like if you're driving a vehicle up a hill, you're burning more power. If you're driving downhill, you burn less power. And so it's the same with this. So if I'm only needing 4 kilowatts, it'll run really light, and it won't run very low. Like it'll get sort of a low frequency. It's a diesel engine, right? So when you're running it hard, it's louder. You hear it more. Whereas if you're not running it, you don't notice it as much. But yeah, that's the genset. So it's all piped through. So basically what we did here is I built this enclosed area for the generator, because for the first little while last year, we set the genset up between those 2 windows, and it was my original plan to keep it there, and then I was going to build an enclosure unit like this around it, and then it would be there. But I just found I'd be in my office like doing a live stream or something like that, and then the generator would kick on and I could feel it and hear it, and I didn't like that. So we decided to move it, because when I first built the system, and this is the kind of live and learn mistakes you can make if you don't think everything through perfectly at the beginning. And for a big part of what I do, I just kind of wing it. I'm just like, let's just go. Let's just do it. I, of course, do planning, but I've done a lot of just flying by the seat of my pants. But that's kind of how I get things done, instead of overthinking things and, kind of having this analysis through paralysis through analysis. I just go at it. And that's partly why I'm here bringing you videos and I don't have to have a day job. We had my first solar panel rig was here, and that was this one. And so we moved it because I didn't realize that it would get as much shade as it did from this, and so it was a problem. And people might say, well, isn't it shaded now by this building? No, not at all. And now we're past the winter solstice, so this panel doesn't get shaded by this building whatsoever. It's worked out perfectly. So we moved that whole panel rig from this pad to there, which made this better, because then now I got a southeast panel. I've talked about these in the past, but they line up better. It's more aesthetically pleasing, and I get more sunlight out of it. And then I said, well, then let's use those concrete pads that those panels are sitting on and move the generator there. And I want to put my wood boiler there. So that's kind of what's going on in this building. I've got my generator and my tidy tank for diesel here, and then I've got my wood boiler, which isn't running yet. We're still doing a lot of plumbing with this, and then I'll have some room for firewood in here, and that's how it's all set up. And over here, this is the tidy tank that's connected to the generator. So this is 600 liters of diesel, which we've burned through. We burned through a lot this year. We burned through, so far, 450 liters. Now, the reason for that, mainly, is because in November, I was still running my dump load. So I have a solar, I'm going to have many dump loads on the system. This is actually another thing people ask me about, is what do you do with all the excess electricity? Well, we do a number of things. We heat hot water. We pump water up the hill. We charge the Tesla. And once the house is done, there'll be some more dump loads in there. But we were using for the summer, spring, and fall, we were using a hot water tank, electric hot water tank, to dump excess electric solar into, which is a great thing to do, because then you essentially get free hot water. But I can toggle between my domestic hot water tank, electric, and my propane gas on demand. And so we've plumbed it so that you can use either or. Once the house is done, I'm going to be plumbing this all together in a way where it all works in sync at once. It's very complicated, and we're still figuring out how that's all going to work, but we know it'll work. But the way we did it in the cabin, just because it's kind of temporary, is there's a domestic hot water tank, and then there's a propane on demand. And I turn on the domestic hot water tank to use that from basically April through October, and then I'll turn the propane back on for the winter. The problem is my propane tank went down. There was a really old one, not my propane tank, but my propane on demand heater went down, and it took a while to get a replacement. It's harder to get things these days. So basically for November, I was burning electricity to heat our water, and I literally burned, 250 liters more diesel than I needed to. So costly mistake for sure, but not that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things. But so that's a bit of a derailment there. But so 600 liters of diesel should be enough to, going forward, get us through a couple winters, really, because once we had our domestic hot water tank thing sorted out and we just went to propane, and propane is so efficient for heating, we only used 100 liters of diesel. So I'm thinking next winter we'll probably only burn about 150, maybe 200 liters of diesel to run this once we have all that sorted out. And, you know, going over to the rest of this building, this is where the genset and the diesel is, but it's also a firewood shack. And so my boiler's there. It's not finished yet. We'll do videos on that another time. It's a central boiler, Classic Edge 560. That's going to heat all these buildings, but these buildings also have wood stoves, and I've got a wood cook stove in the house, and it's a complicated system, and I'm not going to get into it now because people will just be chiming in and telling me what I should or should not do. But we've got that going along. And the cool thing about the boiler is it's going to also heat everything. So we have 3 redundancies built into all of our systems. So we can heat hot water with the wood boiler through just a water-to-waterless heat exchanger that goes into a domestic hot water tank that's also uses dump loads from the electric, and then we'll also have propane on there too. So we can heat water and heat the house technically because we have hydronics in the cabin now. In the house will be all hydronic radiant concrete floors, and there's some forced air units in the greenhouse and garage here. But we'll be able to heat essentially with wood, electricity, and propane technically. So once that's all done, that's how that's going to work. But yeah, so that diesel is plumbed through here, and the great thing about having a big tank hooked up to your generator is that you don't need to worry about filling it up. You fill that up, you know, maybe once a year or something like that, and then you're sitting on a lot of diesel that you can run without having to think about it. So that's what's really cool about the system, is that I don't have to think about it at all anymore. I did when I was first setting it up because I really wanted to understand it, and I wanted to make sure those triggers were going to run, because what if they didn't turn on and then your batteries ran to zero? It would be pretty shitty. So anyways, we've built this enclosing around it, and it's not finished, but what it does is this sound insulates this thing, because this generator is quite noisy. It's the low frequency. I mean, it sounds like my skid steer or my Mini X or something like that when I'm running it. It's a noisy machine. So this thing closes it in, keeps it quiet, and it'll turn on and I won't even know it's on. I mean, if I come out here, I can hear it, but barely. And I can't hear it. Well, if I'm in there in my office or I'm in the cabin, I can't hear the generator at all, and that's what we wanted. So there's a muffler there that comes out, gets it away from the building. Little automatic enclosure there. It's all sealed here, so there's no heat transfer onto the building. It's really good for that. But yeah, it's a pretty cool system, and it does, allow us to not even think about it. I'm just going to check some of my notes here and see if there's anything else in this that no, that's pretty much it. So yeah, that's the big secret there. A lot of people assume that if you're off grid, you aren't going to use any petroleum products, and maybe that's possible, and maybe I'll just riff on a little bit about my thinking with that, because I have thought, wouldn't it be cool just to be able to be solar all the time? But it just really comes down to at what cost. So, my whole system, like I said, has cost about 130 grand Canadian. And if you were to buy this same system today, it would be a lot more, just because of inflation and availability of things and stuff like that. So if I wanted to get, so really what we have in our climate here is we have about a month solid of weather like this at the lowest daylight times of the year. So around the winter solstice, getting close to it or whatever, we have a period of time where there's very minimal daylight hours and we're socked in. And the lowest point I've seen my solar generate in a day has been 1.8 kilowatt hours, which is incredibly low, but there's really only been a handful of days that you see it that low. And then the greatest it would do is about 180 kilowatt hours in the day in the summer, at your sort of best case scenario. But people say, well, why don't you just put more solar in to get you through that time of the winter? And I could do that. It would really involve adding at least another 16 panels. And I could do that. My charge controllers I could add a little bit more. But you just have to think about what's the cost. I mean, really, I priced it out to get kind of bare minimum to do that. I'm looking at about another 20 grand. And I'm not a DIY guy, so I'm going to hire my electrician to come and do it and whatever. So that is what it is. Even if I did it myself, I couldn't be any less than 10 grand for all the material. For what? 100 liters of diesel. That's really what we're looking at. So either 10 grand to make this system so that I can get solar at the darkest and cloudiest time of the year, or I can just spend about 100 liters in diesel, which at today's price is about 150 bucks Canadian. So just think about that amortization process there. I mean, what's 10, let's just be really generous and say I have to spend 10,000, which it wouldn't be, but let's just say it's 10 grand. 10 grand divided by 150 is, maybe 8 years. So it'd take about 8 years to amortize that. So maybe at some point I'll do that. But right now, we've got a lot of other things to do on this homestead, and I can only dedicate so much time to these things. So the system works very well as it is. And I don't mind the diesel. I mean, I use diesel. I've got 2 machines that use diesel. I like diesel. The reason I went with diesel and not propane is that I use diesel up here already. And you can make diesel yourself. Technically, I am not set up to do that, but you can. You can make biodiesel. So I like the resilient side of that with diesel. Diesel is an oil and not it's different than gasoline and propane. And diesel engines self-lubricate in a sense too. So there's some longevity in that, which I like. And the machine's simple. Diesel is a very easy fuel to store, whereas propane is more difficult to store. Gasoline is really hard to store because it doesn't last very long. But diesel you can sit on for many years. And we cycle our fuel too. And I have 1, 2, 3, 4 tidy tanks on this property, so I have the ability to store a lot of fuel. And there's a resilient aspect to that too. But we do use propane, and my whole boiler system, once it's all said and done, we'll have a propane backup as well. So we'll be able to burn wood, which is my preference, because I have a lifetime of 30 acres of wood here on my property. And just from thinning the forest and doing good fire mitigation and knocking down dangerous trees and things like that is going to give me firewood for many years to come. So I prefer fire, but we do have the potential with backup with propane. But I'll do that in another video. So anyways, I'll leave that here for this one, folks. If you guys like this, if you want to see more videos like this, smash the like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't. I'll see you in the next one. Check out my site, fromthefield.tv. It's where I post all my vlogs and the vast majority of all my content. All right, guys, we'll see you in the next one.